皆さんこんにちは。藤倉大です。今から、質問を始めたいと思います。First of all, big congratulations for receiving Kyoto Prize. And it is, I'm sure I can speak on behalf of everybody that we are really happy that you are here with us in Kyoto. And today I would like to ask you about composition, but more of an act of composing. So,
well, if you are speaking of the art of composing, you are asking me about many things, and especially the act of composing is never the same. At each work, it is slightly different. Slightly different in the sense that sometimes you begin by a combination of instruments because you want to hear a sonority. Sometimes you begin, on the contrary, by a musical idea which can be developed. Sometimes that's just the continuity of things which is important, and that depends by what you begin. And I will elaborate later. I begin with one example, the example of a sound. I wanted once to make a piece which finally was called Éclat. That was the sound which was interesting to me. I took instruments mainly with resonance, from the piano through the cembalo, to the guitar, to the mandolin. So with instruments of a resonance more or less long or more or less short. And then I said, yes, okay, that's interesting to have such a group of instruments with such a sound. But what I can do with them, because now that you've chosen the sound, you must choose the composition, how you compose, precisely, because the act of composing is not only using a type of sonority, but what to do with this sonority and what the instruments which produce this sonority. Then I want to use this sonority. How can I use them? Of course, what interests me, that's the various lengths of sonority. So, which implies that I don't want a meter. I don't want to suppress this sonority, but I want this sonority to develop by itself. And if I have a big resonance in the low register of the piano, I want to listen this resonance. I know that, for instance, a resonance of the vibraphone will be half as long as that, and the mandolin maybe a tenth out of that. So I can analyze by listening only to a chord. I can analyze the various components of this chord. But if I do, for instance, a chord very short, all instruments playing very short, then I cannot make anything with the combination itself, because that's too short to be analyzed. And then I have already one element of composition, or two elements of composition, the element that I don't want any kind of rhythmical obligation, and I want to be the sound to be either analyzed or not analyzed. And then, as there is no rhythmical obligation, the third consequence is that the relationship between the conductor and the instrumentalist is totally free and can be used at the last minute. So if, for instance, that's like a keyboard, instead of having keys one after another, I have simply instruments and instrumentalists. So if I say, for instance, the vibraphone comes first, the harps come second, the cembalo comes third, and so on and so forth, then I decide at the last minute, myself, as a conductor, and I give the cues to each instrumentalist. Next time it will be a different order. And that I begin to introduce the kind of aleatoric factor, which is the consequence of all the other phenomenon. So you see, I don't want to describe further, but once you have one very important data, then you can deduce the other one. And what is the consequence for me when I compose now, when I have all these deductions? Of course, it was not deduced so logically, progressively I discovered the way of using this group. But the consequence is that I give the impression in the same time of something totally free and in the same time something under control. Under control and free. And that, the feeling given by this piece is something like floating in the air and without any kind of precise direction. But you have events, one after another, which relate only in your imagination.
Okay. Now you have described about the piece Éclat, how you composed more or less. Could you give us just one more example, which is contrast to Éclat, for instance?
Well, yes. Also, I mean, the structure, for instance, is for me important. When I composed a piece like Exposant Fixe, then I had in view the kind of thing you organize with different colors. For instance, you have some moments with such a color of instruments and of use of the instruments. Then an episode, let's say episode A. Episode B will be with a different type of invention, musical invention, and then also with a different color, instrumental color. Then you have episode C and so on. And then with these episodes, you begin to organize that. That's, for instance, episode A will come back after C, but episode D will come after the A2. And then after D1, the episode B2 will come, and so on and so forth. So you organize the combination. You recognize them, but you don't know when they will come back. And that's very important because you recognize something. For instance, I use that's very much on purpose. That, for instance, the organization of pitches is the same. So immediately your reaction is automatic. You recognize, yes, that's this type of element. But why at this moment, I don't know. And I must really listen to the piece to understand the combination of this piece. And it forces you to use elements completely recognizable by some dimension that now you recognize it is in the same time recognizable and predictable. That's a kind of a technique like mosaic. If you see mosaic, that's exactly organized this way. You have a design, but the design is made by things which repeat themselves, but repeat themselves in a different context, so that the real design is the combination of everything. And you have, in the same time, the small components and the big design. And all these mosaic are conceived like that.
Well, next question I would like to ask, because you have just spoke about pitch contents of the certain section or certain material, and I want to ask you, do you sketch before you start composing the piece? Well, actually, I know you do sketch because I've seen some of the sketch, I think, and I'm just interested in more details of this. I mean, how much sketch do you do before you write the first note in the full score?
Oh, that depends upon the work I am writing. If I am writing a work where I had already elements, then I don't need sketch at the very beginning. I use already the elements I have in my hand, and I use them, and I began to work at a certain level. But on the contrary, if I have absolutely nothing, I begin in a funny way to think totally detached of what I want to compose. Because I think, contrary to what is generally thought, that if you are thinking quite far from the work you want to compose, you can find solution you will never be able to find if you are already concentrated on one work. And I think, I begin with some quite abstract studies, which were very much influenced by painting, for instance, or by literature. So I take this opportunity of reading, for instance, or looking at an exhibition to say that would suggest to me this type of solution, totally detached of any context. And then after that, when I begin to compose, then I begin to introduce them into a context. And about that, I can give the example of Paul Klee. He gave classes of drawing in the Bauhaus in Germany in the 30s. And then that's very interesting to see his relationship with his students, because he gave sometimes exercise to do exercise. I insist on the word because that's not really invention, that exercise. He gave, for instance, a circle and a line, just that. And he said, now think about what you can do with that. And in the same time, he was himself composing a painting from these very simple elements. But I mean, he was so inventive that even the most simple geometry gave him a kind of incentive to invent something he would never have found by himself, just like that. And for instance, he did something with the chessboard in a kind of abstract repetition of black and white. And then, I mean, with the chessboard, he's very inventive, and you could not imagine what he invented just from this chessboard idea. So, for instance, that's very important to me, that if you concentrate on something which seems very far, it is in reality very close to what you want to do.
Well, just one last question about this topic, because I've just found it really interesting, especially when you spoke about sketches which is detached from the final work. Just one last question for this. With this sketch, especially the one which is detached to the final piece, does it contain pitches and rhythms, or more like sentences, or?
No, sometimes not. Sometimes it's very vague, let's say, in applications. I don't need really musical events to do that. I imagine musical events, but I mean, that's like a shorthand invention. From this shorthand, I can imagine what will come later. I will tell you, for instance, in Derive 2, I began to look at some works, late works of Ligeti. And then, I mean, I saw the periodicity in Ligeti, which is rather simple, but very efficient. And I know that he refers to especially to the African music, with the periodicity of African music, popular music, I mean. And then, I mean, that was very interesting to me, and I began to think in this direction, but without noting rhythms, for instance, just to see it can be this way, or this way, or this way. Totally detached from any datas, but progressively I take the datas and I organize, and when you organize, you're obliged to go further, of course, because you cannot just play with some vague elements. But at the beginning, that's something which was quite far, and that the period for me, as I mean, where the influence are capital.
Okay. Well, we could talk about this topic. I pass it really just for
hours
and hours. But
you asked me about how I go to compose, and I was describing many.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Sorry to be that long.
Yes, it's great. But yeah, if I had 4 hours, 5 hours, I would like to ask even more questions. But I think I would control myself to go next topic of the question, which is I would like to ask you about revisions, because you are a very known composer that you always revise the piece or extend the piece. And my question is that you always extend your work, but you never seem to add anything before the opening of the piece. I was wondering, does that mean that you know exactly how the piece should start, but then you don't know, or you don't want to know how the music should end?
Not true always. For instance, I just answer very quickly, but I mean, I give you exactly the contrary of an example. When I was doing Répond, for instance, I knew very well the beginning. Of course, I began. But after that, I was meandering and going through a lot of developments. But I knew I composed the end before everything else. And I knew that the end should be that, absolutely. because the end was a kind of contrast with the entrance of the soloists. The soloists are entering as a whole like that, and I wanted this dramatic gesture to be again there at the very end. So therefore I composed the end. But that's so because the form is like a spiral, let's say. I don't want to enter the details, but I mean like spiral. And the spiral, wherever you finish it, is finished. And you up the end, it is longer, but wherever you are, that's finished. And therefore I arranged myself always when I was expanding the piece to know that it could be the end. And therefore I thought about the end before, you know, the middle sections.
Okay, let's change the subject just for now. Let's talk about influences. Could you just please tell us what is your musical influence?
The musical interest.
No, influence.
So
interest as well as
sorry,
influence.
Interest or influence, that's exactly the same. So anyway, the influences are from many different sides. First, I mean, I was very much interested not only in our European culture, but culture from other countries, what one calls non-European cultures or Western cultures generally. So for me, I was very much interested in the culture of Asia, especially of Africa, and I'm speaking of traditional cultures because they have a richness which has disappeared totally in our Western countries. And therefore, I was interested to listen to a lot of recordings of Japanese music, as a matter of fact, traditional Japanese music, Chinese theater music especially, Tibetan music, religious music, which is fantastically interesting. And then, I mean, also the culture of Bali and the culture of Africa, I said. And these cultures are related with the sound also. And that's very interesting to relate sound and culture and technique, instrumental technique. And that was very, for me, interesting to adapt these sounds, this culture of sound in my work. For instance, from Bali, I like the music. I was wondering about the music, of course. But I mean, what was interesting to me, that's the kind of sonority produced by metal. And the gamelan, for instance, has a sonority which is unique. And if you listen to the traditional music in Africa, that's on the contrary instruments with wood, which are important. And our xylophone is part of this family. So, for instance, if I think of my own marteau sans maître, the vibraphone could not have been written without the influence of Bali, and the marimba could not have been written without the influence of Africa. And then, I mean, for me, I mean, the percussion instruments come from all these non-European cultures because they have developed a sense for the sonority and for the use of the percussion, which was totally ignored in our tradition. So that was one side of it. I did not, you know, import, so to speak, the music itself, but I went down deep into the fundamental of this music, sound as structure also, and then also for me that was a very strong influence. Non-European music was very influential on my, there are other influences I will speak about. Of course, so there were influence also from our culture. I'm not speaking from the classical culture, because I also, when I was a child, I played Mozart, I played Beethoven, I played Brahms even. But also for me, the revelation of the modernity was with Debussy. And when you think of what modernity, it was very funny, but when you think of that now, that was the first arabesque Debussy. Because there is a kind of melodic line which is unique by Debussy, and you discover already in this arabesque. But I mean, all after that, I discovered the preludes, for instance, and that was for me a world which was opening, and also Ravel in the same time, the sonatine for piano, for instance, and things like that. And then after, of course, I discovered, especially immediately after the war, I discovered Stravinsky, Bartók, which were never performed during the wartime, and also the Viennese school, Schoenberg, of course, but also Berg, and especially Webern, which was totally new for us. And then, I mean, this kind of tradition I was discovering in the same time. You know, we were, during the war, we heard nothing of that, but immediately after the war, there was a lot of it, and you discovered everything in the same time. So that was a kind of influence turning around. When I had enough of Schoenberg, because I thought, for instance, the rhythmical aspect was not strong enough, I turned to Stravinsky and Bartók. When I thought that Stravinsky and Bartók sometimes the counterpoint was not enough, or the polyphony was too simple, then I turned again to Schoenberg. And you know, things like that were very important to me. And when I find that the sonority of the orchestra was quite new in the late works of Debussy, for instance, then I turned to Debussy. And then, I mean, I tried not to make on purpose a synthesis, but anyway, the synthesis was in me to organize all these influences, but I say not stylistically, but deeply how they organize their world.
Okay. You have already spoke about well, these two composers, Debussy and Stravinsky. I would like to ask you this question, actually this question from the audience. Which works of Debussy and Stravinsky influenced you the most?
Well, by Stravinsky, of course, that was very clear. Rite of Spring was the biggest influence. But without forgetting the previous works. So for me, I mean, Firebird is very, very interesting because he masters already the art of the orchestra really marvelously well. So it's really, from this point of view, that's really a masterpiece. And then, I mean, Petrushka was more original, let's say, and more typical Russian. But I mean, Rite of Spring was more detached. That's also a Russian, let's say, description of such a ritual. But I mean, for me, if you can very well imagine, that's a ritual for any kind of pagan situation. But also in Les Noces, again, that's very interesting because the Les Noces is, again, very extremely Russian, but also that's a continuous work because Rite of Spring is, you know, rather like a ballet. You have one tableau, second tableau, third tableau, and so on, all that one after another. There are very few construction in that, very little construction of themes, for instance. But in Les Noces, you have that. And that's, you know, it's continuously, and that's interesting. That's maybe the first time that Stravinsky writes something absolutely continuous. And that's, for me, that's his best period. And with all the small works which he has written during the period in Switzerland. I don't like, and I still don't like, neoclassicism, Stravinsky, because I think that's not his character, not his temperament. I think he was very much influenced by the French intellectuals, and I think that's not the best influence he had to have. Now, what concerns Debussy, that's really a very special chapter, because generally, I mean, and in France for a long time, Debussy was considered as a very good composer at the beginning and a very weak composer at the end. And even I remember Messiaen, who really was very respectful about Debussy, was still more or less of this opinion. So he was really delighted with Pélez and Mélisande, especially with the three nocturnes, with Après-midi, Symphone, with La Mer. But I mean, after that, he did not like very much Debussy. He thought it was much weaker. And I remember also, I mean, I had a discussion with him about the 12 Etudes, especially for piano. And then he was really not, you know, not saying no, of course. That's a bad composer. But I mean, he thought the works were weaker compared to that. And on the contrary, I think these last works, Jeux, the ballet piece, and then the 12 Etudes for piano especially, are really one of his masterpieces. And with the Etude, it was really extraordinary because, for instance, he used exactly the trick that used by Chopin already, were etude with the sixth, etude with the thirds, etude, and so on. And he added an etude with the fourth for him, which was, at this time, rather difficult to organize. And then, étude pour les arpèges composés, kind of things, imagination. And you can find that, I studied this etude very carefully, and I find the amount of invention is absolutely incredible, given, the little resources he had at his disposal. He wanted this lack of material, but he used this small material at the most he could do. And then, for instance, also the originality of the instruments. For instance, in the three last sonatas, the most interesting is the one for flute, viola, and harp, which is a combination. And he planned another one, which he did not do because he was dying at this time. But he wanted to have oboe, horn, and cembalo. And that's really very extraordinary, the kind of combination. He wanted to go further and to organize the sound world differently.
Okay, one last question in this topic of influences, which I really want to know about this. Obviously, that's why I'm asking. You have spoken about influences now from the other composers, and I was wondering, how do you fight off the influences? What I mean is that if you are, let's say, if you are a pianist, if you can play like Pollini, I mean, you may not be the most original pianist because there's a Pollini, but again, you are not. We must be pretty good pianist if you can play like Pollini. But when it comes to composing, well, you like something, you are influenced by something, but sometimes you might have to fight off of these influences, or you don't think it's necessary?
I don't need to fight influences. On the contrary, I welcome them because I am not directly influenced, but I am influenced by the problem the composer brings and how the way he solves them. And that's interesting me to go to the depths, especially to see the fundamental of the composer. For instance, when I was teaching in Bâle, I did a complete analysis of the 12 Etudes by Debussy. And therefore, it helped me to deliver me from the kind of weight of the 12-tone theory and 12-tone theory. Because I think the intervals are more important sometimes locally than, for instance, a 12-tone. And therefore, I began to pay attention to the interval themselves and how the chords can generate themselves. So, I am very happy about it. And you can with great difficulty, if I don't tell it, you cannot see this type of influence. The influence should not be recognizable. That's, for me, the principle. When you are writing something or when you are thinking of writing something, then also everything is a prey. You take exactly what is necessary for your invention. And then also, I am not at all afraid of that because I know that nobody will recognize the influence which were in that because I transform them completely and I make them part of myself.
Okay, there are a lot more questions I'd like to ask, but just I think now I would like to ask questions from the audience, and yes, if there isn't too little questions, then I'll ask you my own questions.
Listening to your music and pieces and composition, I find your pieces rather perfect, quite symmetrical in a matrix-like manner. And I suppose that this aspect of perfection comes from the philosophy and thinking of Europe, maybe influenced by the relationship between the God and human being in the Christian thinking. But when we think of a sound or even the world, we cannot interpret everything through this digital type of philosophy that is quite popular in the Western world. But rather, the Asian type thinking, like maybe one we have in Japan, can play a part in interpreting the world. For example, in Japan, we see a moon, a full moon, which is beautiful. But Japanese people find the beauty in the moon when it has some cloud, a very thin cloud over the moon. And that kind of a sensitivity may be one way of interpreting the world and everything in the world. This example may be an extreme example, but as I talk with my friends, we all think that this world cannot be interpreted and understood correctly, even if we take the approach of perfection only. How do you think?
Well, that's a long,
非常に長い質問でしたが
that's a very long statement. Must I answer by yes or no? No, certainly, I mean, I think that my perfection is not that perfect. That's the first answer I will do, because if I am not satisfied myself by what I have done, and Dai Fujikura told that I am working very much on the work, that's not to find the perfection, that's to find maybe the truth, which is, and truth and perfection are not always synonym. And therefore also for me, which is important, that's to reach the goal which I want to obtain. And this kind of perfection is not my obsession at all. And I am, like Japanese, full moon, when there is only no cloud at all, that's very beautiful to look at, but a little bit boring. But if you have some clouds, that's more interesting. That's true, because you have two shapes which are fighting each other, and you look at the fight and not only at the moon and the cloud. So there is a third perception which is more important than the two other ones. And I think that's also part of my philosophy. For instance, I was telling when I was speaking of éclat that, for instance, if a chord is played and you let the resonance, then also mean you let the resonance, and that's being perfect because the instruments have their type of resonance and you can listen to it. On the contrary, when I have a chord which is very short but played by the same type of instruments, I cannot recognize anything. So that's far from perfection. I destroy the perfection on purpose. So therefore, you know, I am not at all convinced by perfection myself. I try to find moments of good balance, but I let also sometimes discrepancies have their saying.
My question is this. Now, I understand that as a musical director at the Bayreuth Music Festival, you have conducted, and also as...
I have not understood, I'm sorry. Could you?
Bayreuth Musical Festival. And also, you conducted the premiere of Lulu of Arbanberg. And also, you've conducted as well, conducted opera pieces, and also you have composed Le Marteau sans Maître or Pli et sans Pli with some vocal songs. However, you have never composed a piece for theater accompanying the stage performance. And I wonder why. And I would like to ask if you have had any idea of composing such a theatrical piece in the past, or will you be composing such in the future?
Well, that's very easy to answer because, yes, I had the intention at one point to go into the theater, musical theater, also, I mean, let's say opera, to give a name which is already exists. That for me, that was very interesting because I attended the theater. You know, I was at the beginning responsible for the stage music in a very important actors company in the 46 to 56. I spent 10 years of my life, also moderately, of course, said, in a theater, in a play theater, not in an opera, in a play theater. But then, I mean, I learned very much to observe the directors and to observe how he was putting a play on the stage. And therefore, I was interested. But I mean, I did not have the opportunity to think about it really seriously. But when I saw the play by Jean Genet, Les Paravents, then I was very touched by that because I thought that was a kind of play which could accept music. So I got in touch with Genet, whom I knew, and I say, could you write for me something, you know, kind of which could be transformed in a kind of theater with music, and so kind of opera, but I mean, I don't like this word because this word has so many connotations that I could not think really about it. And then, I mean, he began to work with me rather regularly, and then he was very sick, he had cancer, and he died before really something was achieved. So Daniel Barenboim, who knew about it, put me in relationship with Heiner Müller. And, you know, I make the story, long story short, but Heiner Müller did die also during the process, practically of the same disease like Genet. And I began to be in doubt about if I put a bad fate on the people who were supposed to work with me. Therefore, I stopped to think about it. And also there was the problem that because I did, I think, very good experiences with Patrice Chéreau, with Peter Stein, with Michael Gruber, and then I mean that was for me, and with Wieland Wagner earlier, of course, and that was very important to me to work with the director from the very beginning. So therefore, I hesitated, and I'm still hesitating because for me, what disturbs me in the opera, which disturbs me also in concert, as a matter of fact, that you obey always to the same shape: stage, pit, and then audience. And then I think also, I mean, that's for an experience in the theater is too much behind the time. Look, if you have seen, for instance, experimental theater, the experimental theater has transformed completely the geography of the theater. And then also for me, I would like to do the same with the opera. But with the opera, that's much more difficult because you have to have forces in a different way, organized in a different way, and also the acoustical problems are much bigger. And therefore, you know, I hesitated, and I still hesitate. Until what age I will hesitate, I cannot tell you. To finish with this chapter very rapidly, I would like to say that also in the theater of the Western tradition, we were not inventive at all from a certain point of view. For instance, when I saw here the traditional theater, either the No or the Bunraku especially, I was very impressed. And I think also we have never used this type of relationship of the theater, the visual and the sound or the music. We have never thought of that in this direction. And I think also, I mean, this kind of for instance, theater of shadows, theater of marionettes, of puppets, theater of you know, like the No, so symbolic. And so we've never had that. And I would like, you know, if I do something for the theater, I would like to try this kind, not to imitate, but I mean to use to a kind of reflection on how the theater was presented here, and how the theater was presented in our Western culture. And therefore, I think, I mean, we presented that rather in a kind of rather poor relationship between the story and the people. I discussed that with Patrice Chéreau and with Gruber especially. I did a show in Aix-en-Provence where we performed the Defalia, then we performed Renard Stravinsky, and then at the end, the Pierre Lunaire by Schoenberg. And then, as I mean, the Falia was with puppets, the Stravinsky was with mimes, and the Pierre Lunaire was with the singer and the musicians on the stage. And that was very interesting with these three pieces, which were not composed for any kind of relationship like that. But that was very interesting to see suddenly, you know, for the first piece, the musician in the pit and the singers on the stage. The second piece, the singers in the pit with the musician in the pit. And for the third piece, the singer on the stage and the musicians on the stage. So you had three types of relationship between the voice and the instruments and the choreography, or the let's say the production. And that was very interesting because we began to invent a theater which was totally unknown in our tradition. So if I do something, that would be to destroy first the kind of Western habits, which I cannot stand anymore.
Being an attorney and a lawyer, I am in a position pretty far from the world of music. But reading your books and listening to your comments and statement, I find that your comments is quite universal. And not only, you talk not only about music and not only about the world of art, you talk about many different aspects of the world. And that is quite enlightening for me as an attorney. And I can learn a lot from you in doing my job. And therefore, I very much respect you. And so I myself is not an expert in music, and I cannot talk about music. But so my question is, for life, do you have any advice to us general people about, from your experience in your life, what kind of thinking, what kind of a behavior we should have in our life?
I think that's very simple. I answer the question very quickly because I would say, never say no. Just also be open, be curious to other thoughts, to other ways of thinking, to other ways of behavior. And that's for me, you know, what I was always doing myself. Of course, I have the reputation of the country of being a very polemicist sometimes. Yes, when I was in charge of defend some positions, some ideas, I could be hard. But I mean, that was always about ideas, never about persons. And I think that still now, you know, I am very open. For instance, when for instance, Dai Fujikura is exactly an example. When I saw a score of his presented for the Festival of Lucerne, we have every 2 years we have 2 commissions, and I saw this score and I spoke to him and I say, yes, now I will commission, and because I am always open to new talents. And I think so if I'm closing my eyes and not willing to accept that there are new generations coming, then I can go to the cemetery immediately and forever. On the contrary, I think, you know, when I am confronted with younger people, it forces me to put into doubt what I have done and what I am doing. And therefore, I think this curiosity is a vital element of survival. And therefore, if I have just an advice to give, that's please give this element of curiosity always during your life.
I heard or read somewhere that your boo is pronounced shorter than Ray's. So would you please correctly pronounce your name yourself?
Well, it will not surprise you, maybe, but that's Boulez. Okay? So now pronounce it right.
これから正しく発音してくださいっていうことです。In case of the musical instrument, the tone or the color or the timbre can have some variety depending upon the performer of the instrument. But when it comes to the voice, it is quite unique from people to people. Like if you have 10 singers, you will have 10 different voices. And so what is the position of people's voice or vocals in your piece? And also, what is the relationship between the instruments and voices? Do they blend and are they combined in a good manner or blending manner, or do they confront with each other?
Well, certainly there are both situations where they are absorbed by instruments, but in sometimes, on the contrary, I try to blend them with the instruments so that you cannot make really anything that's a kind of complex sound which you cannot analyze because it's too complex to be analyzed so simply. Therefore, I mean, for me, I make a difference between the fact that you must understand the text or you must not understand the text. That's for me very important. Either you give the text the meaning it has, and you develop this kind of meaning, but sometimes you develop, on the contrary, the sonority, the sound. So I will give you an example. Of course, that's why I have not not a score with me, but I mean, I try to be as clear as possible. In my second improvisation on Mallarmé, I use the verses of Mallarmé, and there are 8 syllables in a verse. So at first, I give, you know, the sound is very ornamental, and you have a lot of variation on the pitch, so you lose the meaning of the text because it's buried under a lot of flourishes, let's say. But as a contrast for the next verses, I use, on the contrary, you know, one sound for a syllable. So you get the text very clearly. But how can I get rid of the text and to make the sonority being much more important than the text? I simply separate progressively with rests the syllables. So when the syllables are quite close, you make the sense. When the syllables are farther from each other, then you lose the sense of the text, but you gain the sonority of the text. And therefore, all this piece is based on catching the meaning or losing the meaning, and with different ways, either by ornamentation or by separation. So therefore, also, I mean, that's a typical example from myself, also, I mean, of how I use the text for the sonority or near of the sonority or close to the meaning. Sorry, that's a little complex, but I mean, I cannot really change that. Yeah.
We have only only have 4 minutes, so sorry, I have to ask one last question. Actually, this is, I like to ask, but it's coming from the audience. This question is actually coming from the audience, and which is, which direction music should go, and do you have any message to the young musicians?
Well, to your first question, I say I don't know where it goes, because if you would have asked me this question 50 years ago, where I was very young and still, you know, thinking of the future, I'm still thinking of the future, but I think I am less sure now than I was 50 years ago, because with the experience in the life, you see that very often you think it goes into a direction and it goes into another one. And there is a kind of tree of directions. And that's essential that there is a tree of directions, because if that would be only one direction, first, this direction will be very crowded, first, and second, the diversity is absolutely necessary. What can I say to you, young composer? Work, work, and work. That's the only thing I can say.
Okay, I just been asked to ask you one last question. This is very, very last question. No, sorry. It's about Kyoto Prize, which I think there is a reason why you came all the way to Kyoto, maybe because some philosophy of the Kyoto Prize. Perhaps you could.
Well, I think also, the Kyoto Prize was a great honor first. And I think it's worth going to the place to receive the prize first, because that's a great honor, and I appreciate that really very sincerely. But the second thing, that they did not ask only to be present at the ceremony where the prize is given, but also they asked me, and rightly so, I thought, to have a contact with various groups of people. For instance, tonight, that's the first contact I have with you, and that's interesting for me to have this lively contact. Then, we will have a lecture which will be done, and then a third symposium on one of my pieces, Stravinsky's. And then, that's interesting for me, not just to receive a prize, as really flattering as it is, but also to be part, for a short while, of course, part of your community. And that, I think that's very interesting, and not only very interesting, but very rewarding to have this type of contact. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. On behalf of everybody, thank you very much, Mr. Boulez, for your generous and kind answer. And I think we've all learned an awful lot. And I hope you will enjoy your stay in Kyoto. And once again, congratulations.
Thank you very much.